Sonny has given so much to this community and to this country. He has done so much for young people, for citizenship and for civic obligation. And when I went to Sonny and talked to him about bringing the Preserving the American Dream Conference to Atlanta, he was the first person on board, and I'm so grateful for that. He went out and he sponsored events to invite people. He put out the word that the foundation was doing this and we needed some support and some input and some attendance, and he's just been spectacular. And he's a great friend of Johnny Isakson, Senator Johnny Isakson, so I thought I'd ask Sonny to come up and introduce Senator Isakson, but I'd like you all to give Sonny a great hand for all the help he's been for this conference.
Thank you, Bonita. She's such a great person. I never met any person so enthused about America. I think Bonita Dodd is doing a great job. Only problem I see her is she won't leave the South African accent, while I am. It took me about 15 years to transform to Southern accent from Korean accent. Thanks for the opportunity. I was chosen by Bonita Dodd to introduce today's keynote address speaker, which he is very honored. Is one of American dreams that I was referring to. And all I had to do is pick up the tab for the breakfast this morning. Senator Isakson is a family man and businessman, and he is a public servant. And he served the president of Northside Realty, the company, for 20 years. Northside Realty, in case the people from outside of Atlanta, Northside Realty was a very, very the famous and one of the major real estate brokerage firm in this area for a long time. And Johnny, he sure does understand that owning a home is a major part of anyone's American dream we shall preserve. Johnny served 17 years in Georgia General Assembly and 3 years as a chairman of the Georgia Board of Education. In 1999, Johnny was elected to United States House of Representatives for his first of 3 terms, and before he being elected to U.S. Senate in 2004, a November election. Johnny graduated from University of Georgia and served in the Georgia Air National Guard. And Bill Shipp, the SHIPP, one of the most respected columnists in this area, called Johnny a highway hero. And Johnny knows all about Georgia transportation system. From yesterday, we have unfinished discussion about Georgia rail system, commuter rail system, and then we may continue to that with Johnny's help. Johnny and his wife Diane have been married for 37 years, and they have 3 children and 6 grandchildren. It is time for me to ask you to please join me in welcoming our leader and my hero, Senator Johnny Isakson.
Well, good morning, and I'm always challenged when a group will get up at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday and talk about such important issues. I'm more used in Washington to getting up later and talking about less important issues, especially on Saturday morning. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly delighted to be with the Public Policy Foundation. Sonny Park is a great leader and benefactor of that organization, and Rogers Wade is a great leader of that organization, and they do a great job as testimony when the President of the United States wants to make a major policy address in the South and he asks them to be the host. Then you have to have some level of credibility, and they certainly, in terms of organizations that are on the cutting edge of issues, have the most credibility of anyone that I know of, certainly in the metropolitan Atlanta area in the state of Georgia, and I would suggest the southeastern United States. I'm going to make my Trains, Planes, and Automobiles John Candy speech. That's when I talk about transportation. I love that movie, And if you think about that movie for a second and forget about all the crazy silliness between Steve Martin and John Candy, the fact of the matter is that's a great basis upon which to talk about transportation. And then I'll conclude with a little discussion on my life, the way I earned my living most of my life, and that was in the housing business. On transportation, let's talk about trains. And then we'll go to planes, then we'll go to automobiles, and then we're going to go to buses. That wasn't in the movie, but I wanted to put buses in there. The model for rail in America is broken. And the solution for that, in my judgment, is the aviation model. So I'm going to put those two together for a second. All transportation is subsidized one way or another. The situation with rail, however, is those subsidies are so massive and the cost is so high and the infrastructure is so expensive. But you have pretty much a situation in rail where government's in it from beginning to end. In the aviation model, you have the government putting in the infrastructure, the runways, the FAA, the ILS systems, but the private sector runs the airplanes, hires the pilots, takes people to their destinations. And then the passengers participate in subsidizing the maintenance of the infrastructure the government puts in with the passenger facility charges that are on each airline ticket going each way, and then also, to a certain degree, the taxes, other taxes that are generated by airports. I submitted a proposal to the Federal Transportation Committee in the House, which was approved. There's a study currently going on to study the feasibility of the aviation model on a high-speed rail line from Birmingham to Washington, D.C., with stops in Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham, and Richmond, which are the minimum number of stops so you can really have high speed. If you've ever gone from Atlanta to Washington, you can't ever get up to high speed because you're stopping every 15 minutes. So you've got to have a good stretch which you can run. But if you have a good backbone, just like to the interstate highway system is to the state highway system, if you have a good backbone, then other forms of rail that people advocate, commuter rail, things of that light rail, they work. But they don't work if they're just going point to point and aren't a part of a multimodal situation or an interface. So my first comment on transportation is that rail can be an important component. If you look at the Boston to Washington run, that's a profitable, high-speed line. I have colleagues that commute every day from Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts to serve with me in the Senate. I envy them. I mean, they get up early in the morning, they're in Washington, same time I'm in Washington, they leave when we finish most nights. Some nights they get stuck because the last train out's 8 o'clock. But the fact of the matter is that great. I'd love to have that opportunity. I surely would have loved it after 9/11 when we couldn't fly and I was driving back and forth to Washington. And that's an 11-hour marathon or 10-hour marathon anyway. So, but I think you've got to get a strong backbone off which these other mechanisms of rail feed rather than just have a point-to-point type of an approach, a point-to-point approach, in my judgment, on rail without a thorough interface and with a backbone just cost-wise is not effective. Airplanes. We survived 9/11 as a country, and aviation is still flying, but what the terrorists did on that day shows you how fragile the aviation system can be. Aviation is interesting. Since the Wright brothers flew, there have only been 2 years in which the aviation industry as a whole made a profit. Let me repeat that. Since the Wright brothers flew 102 years ago for the first time, the aviation industry as an industry has only made a profit twice. It is a very tough business. And they have no control over the cost of fuel. They have no control over what the passengers are going to do. They certainly have no control over terrorists or acts of God, but they are critical to the economy of the United States of America. 70% of the value and 10% of the weight of all U.S. exports travel on airplanes. 70% of the value, but only 10% of the weight and volume of American exports travel on airplanes. 30% of the value and 70% of the weight and volume, 90% of the weight and volume travel on ships. That'll give you some perspective of what would happen to us if our aviation system broke down and failed. It's why what we're doing in the reaction to 9/11 is so important. It's why every time you get impatient at an airport because of the security measures we put in, you need to stop and think. Is this as bad as it would be to have to walk everywhere I'm going to go? And I think real quickly you'll understand, is this as bad as it would be if I couldn't export our software and our intellectual property? And I think we've done a good job, much contrary to the critics of so many people. I listened to the speeches all this week on port security about what America hasn't done. But quite frankly, it's quite remarkable what we have done, given from a dead start on the afternoon of 9/11/2001 to today. We have, through intelligence and through hard work and through good security, seen to it that Americans have been safe. And the good Lord willing, and our continued dedication to that, we'll see to it that happens in the future. That covers trains and planes. Let me talk about automobiles for a second. And I served on the Transportation Committee in the House for 6 years, and I serve on the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate. Both of those have jurisdiction over the highway bill. First and foremost, the toughest political fight I ever took on, was in the House of Representatives, where as a member of the Transportation Committee, I took the chairman and the infrastructure of my whole side of the political ledger, the Republican Party, to task on the highway, the redistribution of highway trust fund monies once they go to Washington, to try and bring about some sanity to the bad problem with donor states and beneficiary states. Georgia was a huge donor state. There were some years we were sending $1 to Washington and getting back 79 to 83 cents. That's not good math under any circumstance. Alaska was getting $5.34 for every dollar they sent. Now, there's some understanding for that because of the cost of construction, number of people, expanse of space, but it was a bad formula and a bad model. And I took on, and I lost. I tried to amend the transportation bill in the House in 2004, and I was running for the Senate at the same time. Lost on the floor by about 10 votes when California went the whole turn and went against me at the last minute. But we were successful enough to raise the issue to the level that the bill never passed the House and Senate, and the reauthorization was delayed a year. And I'm very proud that my first year in the Senate, we passed a highway reauthorization bill, a 5-year reauthorization with a new highway formula which guarantees every state will get a minimum of 93 cents back on every dollar it sends to Washington. Now that's fair. What that has meant to the state of Georgia is a $1,250 million increase in the amount of money it will get from Washington over the years between 2005 and 2010. So that's $1,250 million more dollars that's going in. That's not because taxes are going up, because they haven't. It's because we've changed the formula to get states more of an equal parity in terms of getting money back in proportion to how they put the money in. On that issue, I've been talked to about everything from the Hamdan decision to the cost of building roads this morning, so I'll stick to the issue of transportation. But the lady from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution asked me about the difficulties we're now having with the Highway Trust Fund because of the tremendous increase in the cost of petroleum and the tendencies of drivers when petroleum costs go up to not drive as much. Both those things have a negative impact on the amount of revenue the trust fund raises and have a very negative impact on how much you can bill. For example, I saw an article in the paper that said the cost of highway construction was 25% higher than it was a year ago because of the cost of petroleum. I think that's conservatively low if you want to know the truth. Asphalt is pretty much petroleum based. Everything that goes to a highway construction site gets there on a truck, which is petroleum based. I was in the housing business. The largest single component cost of single family housing is petroleum, because every material that gets there on a truck that's run on petroleum, and most of the plumbing and a good bit of the electrical stuff is petroleum based components, or at least a lot of it. So we have a serious problem. That $1,250 million increase over 5 years is not going to buy us near as many highways as we thought it would. So what impact does that have? Well, the first impact is you have to scale back how much you can do. I know the ARC talked, and I can't remember the number, but having to scale back the regional transportation plan in terms of what they could do over the next 10 years, simply because the dollar doesn't buy as much. And that is correct, and that puts great pressure on the system. Fortunately, petroleum is coming down, but I don't think petroleum is going to come down to a level where the impact is not going to be felt. I hope it will, but I doubt that it will. Then you got villains like me. I bought a hybrid vehicle. You know, I bought it because it seemed to make sense. I liked it. I bought a Ford Escape, but I'm getting 38 miles to the gallon now. My pickup truck got 17 and a half. The federal government got a lot more money in the state of Georgia did on me driving my pickup truck than they're going to be on my hybrid. But it's a good common sense buy for the future on the environment side, but it's not a good one on the revenue side, which begs the tremendous challenge we have, and that is to find creative and new sources of financing surface transportation. Just as I suggest the solution to rail is the aviation model in terms of infrastructure, the solution to surface transportation in terms of roads is creative thinking. Public-private partnerships, new types of getting the voter involved in the priorities of the state, and special purpose investments to bring about specific infrastructure improvements. In the state of Georgia, 20 years ago, we created something known as CID, Community Improvement Districts. The first one happened to be in my home district when I served in the legislature. I was a co-sponsor with Roy Barnes. He handled it in the Senate, I handled it in the House. CIDs were a very novel idea. It said, look, we'll take areas that are substantially commercial, let them volunteer to define a boundary, and then get 75% of all the business and commercial investment in that area to agree to establish a community improvement district, give that community improvement district the ability to levy up to 5 mills of taxes on themselves, and then leverage that money for infrastructure improvements. The result of that CID is we now have, I think, 13 CIDs in the state, maybe more than that, but I think it's 13. If you want to see an example of what that did, that little 5 mil self-imposed levy on commercial only built the Kennedy interchange. If you ever want to see an interchange between two interstate highways and a major old regular highway, go to US 41, 285, and 75, and Acres Mill Road and Cumberland Boulevard. That happens to be where my Senate office is, and I drive to that office every day and never have to get on 41, 75, or 285. And it's all because of that creative engineering, which is all because the people in that area, Hines and Post Properties, John Williams, a lot of very creative people got together and said, you know, if we could build this, it would work. And they levied 5 mills of taxes on themselves, levied it with the federal and state highway money, and built a $147 million interchange, which is generating huge revenues because of the development around it, because of the sense around it, and because of the economy around it. Secondly, we create a special purpose local option sales tax and allowed local governments, counties, to levy a 1-cent tax for infrastructure improvements in 6 defined categories, of which roads were one. My home county, which is Cobb County, which grew in my years in business from 197,000 to 800,000 people, had a huge pressure in terms of the need to build more roads. Motor fuel tax in Georgia is low. We're still, I guess, 49th. It's 7.5 cents fixed per gallon and a 4% state sales tax. So it's give or take 11.5 cents a gallon. Tennessee's 23. You can go around, look around us. It's double in most of the states. The local option sales tax has been a huge help to leverage local money to improve roads. Cobb is, the last one Cobb did raised $1 billion over 5 years, and the voters love it. It's a 1-penny tax. They get to vote on it. It's a 5-year sunset, and you can't extend it unless they vote again. That's government at its best. Government at its worst is give me a tax and it stays on forever, like the 3-cent tax on your telephone. Government passed that to pay off the Spanish-American War. There were 25,000 telephones in the country when they passed that tax. There are 25,000 telephones probably in this building. And the Spanish-American War has long since been paid for, but that tax ain't going away, and the voters know that. Now, there's going to be a proposal this year in the Georgia legislature to take that one step further. I understand they're going to talk about a regional levy. And if you take the RDCs in Georgia, we have regional development centers which do the modeling and the planning to satisfy the federal government highway transportation review. They do the transportation improvement plans and the regional transportation plans. Have a vote within that specified region to levy a 1-penny tax for specific construction projects and let the tax last for a specific number of years subject to renewal by the voters. And I would predict if that passes And I think, I predict if that gets past the legislature, the voters will ratify that. The ARC then can come to the people and say, okay, if we have a 1-cent levy over the next 5 years, and I believe it's 19 counties that are in ARC or something close to that. I don't know how much it'll raise, but if it'll raise in Cobb County $1.2 billion over 5 years, ain't no telling what it'll raise in the 19 counties. If we do that, then we'll build an east-west connector. That may be not as politically popular, so whatever else it might be. And the voters will get to see where the tax is going. They'll know it goes away in 5 years. They'll know what benefits they're going to get for it. They'll vote for it. My judgment. Second thing you can also do, obviously, is use tolls. That's an alternative source of revenue other than a new tax or other than the motor fuel tax. 400 paid for itself a lot faster than it was ever projected. And I love my cruise card, and I love being able to get on 400 and get somewhere. And tolls, roads have their place. Now, I know the trucking community doesn't like them, and there are a lot of other people that don't like them. In fact, nobody likes to have to pay money to do anything, but it's a practical matter. If you don't have money, you can't do anything. So I think hot lanes and smart lanes and things like that make sense in the tolling process, and tolls make sense in the construction of certain roads. And then you have the public-private partnership, where the private sector actually comes in, contracts with the government to put in infrastructure and then maintain it and run it for a period of time in return for the revenues it takes off of that. The Indiana project is the most recent project, but there are other projects. There are private companies that do bridges. There are private companies that do specific components to transportation. And that certainly has a role. So we're going to have to be creative and think outside the box. But the day of government just levying a tax because they need more money to do something they'll tell you about later ain't going to fly. People got to know what they're getting for the money, and it's got to address their needs. And out of it comes really better planning. Now, I'm talking too long, but I'll go to buses real quickly. Bus rapid transit, to me, makes a whole lot of sense. And I think it's beginning to make some sense in Georgia. I think Greta is doing, I see the Greta buses all the time now. Getting people from point A to point B. I personally am a supporter of the shoulder-only bus lanes on 400. I'm a supporter of taking the MARTA corridor north of the North Spring Station into Forsyth County, and instead of paying the cost of what it's going to cost to run the rail up there, which I doubt we'll ever be able to do, is make that a bus-only road. You got most of the right-of-way, and just run buses back and forth. You'd be amazed how many people want. The problem today with MARTA for me, like going to the airport when I go to the Senate and I fly every week, by the time I've driven from my house to the North Spring Station, I just feel like I might as well drive the rest of the way. But if I had a bus within a mile of my house that's going to take me to the North Spring Station and take me over to MARTA, I'd get on it in a heartbeat. Once again, it's that multimodal concept that makes transportation work, and I think and buses allow you that flexibility that trains don't, because trains run on fixed track that's in a fixed place. That's not a negative statement about trains. They have a role, I've explained that. But it needs to be a coordinated role with all other forms of transportation. Now, lastly, let me just talk about housing for a moment. I spent 33 years in the single-family housing business. My company sold 11,000 houses a year. I know a little bit about houses. Home ownership is the difference in the United States of America and every other country in the world. If you ever think about it for a second, 70% of America owns their own home. We're a nation of owners. The rest of the world are nations of tenants. You've been a tenant, certainly you. I'm a tenant in Washington. Now, I try and take care of my little apartment, but I don't take near as good care of my little apartment as I do my house, because I own my house, and it's an asset. Don't ever kid yourself. The strength of this country, if there's one component part, the private ownership and wide distribution of the ownership of the land is the central difference in us and the rest of the world, and how our people think and how we operate, and always will be. So I'm a huge advocate for opening doors for home ownership for all Americans. I served on the board of Fannie Mae, which is under a lot of criticism now, not for the years that I served, but now they're under a lot of criticism. But and Jim Johnson reigns, and the new fellow that's in there, his name escapes me right now. They've done a great job of opening opportunities to housing that never existed before in America. The B, C, and D credits, the housing initiatives for environmental sensitivity, the housing initiatives for those giving them a second chance in life are the reason we went from 67 to 70% home ownership in America. We've got to take that to the next step, however. You're seeing a tremendous increase right now in the delinquencies on the subprime loans. It's up to 12.4%. It's going to get higher, particularly going to get higher when the adjustable rate loans continue to adjust, which they're doing this year and next, because interest rates are higher than they were, and probably going to stay there for a while. And you're going to have a lot of people who borrowed and bought a house first time ever at a 4 1/4 2-year ARM, and all of a sudden it's going to go to 6 1/4, and the payment's going to go up by 40%, and they're not ready for that. And one of the things we got to do is we got to do a good deal of making loans that help in turn to educate people on what it's like, what you need to do to be a good homeowner. I'm a big believer in giving people when you give a subprime loan, make a subprime loan to an individual at a higher rate because they're a higher risk. If they pay on time for 36 consecutive months, give them a break on the interest rate. In other words, give them an incentive to do what's right as a homeowner. If you give them that, they'll think more about, well, what's going to happen if this ARM's going to go up. There are a lot of things we can do. Secondly, you have to continue to think outside the box in terms of housing itself. When I got in the business of housing, everybody when Georgia wanted a half-acre lot. Any lot that was smaller was absolute blasphemy. I went to more zoning hearings, got cussed out by more people who thought we were going to destroy the world when 15,000 square foot lots. And now today, with clusters and zero lot lines, and condominiums, you got tremendous density, but you also have smart development now. You have sites being developed where you count, in terms of the ratio of lots per acre, mitigation for wetlands land or other land that's undevelopable. So over time, over the time of spreading the space, you have lower density than you might on the particular acres that are developed, and you get a much better development. I always brag about my dear friend John Williams, but if you ever drive by old Weinstocks, which is now Carithers, in the 4,000 block of Roswell Road, there's a swamp there, cattails growing up and everything else, with this beautiful apartment complex. Well, John Williams bought that and took the swamp and turned it into an amenity. You go look at Wild Timber subdivision in Gwinnett County, its amenity package is not a golf course. Its amenity package is not a huge number of tennis courts or an overwhelming pool complex. Its amenities are the 43 acres they left undisturbed with the walking trails and the bicycle paths that go along the Chattahoochee River and all through the development. That's good, smart land planning, good, smart land use, and then when you adjust the densities to allow the developers to recover on the land that is developable, you have a win-win situation. So comprehensive land planning combined with financing that begs responsible home ownership is the cue for us and ensures for us in the 21st century that housing will be affordable to as many Americans as possible. And the day that stops is the day we're not as strong a country as we are today, because the wide distribution of home ownership and the ownership of land is a key cornerstone of this great country. I haven't looked at my watch, but I know I've probably talked too much because 3 people are asleep and 1 lady's about to go, so I'm going to stop and see if anybody has any questions. Anybody have a question? I'll be glad to try and respond. Yes, sir.
Would you talk a little bit more about the details of the Indiana Public-Private Partnership?
Well, I will by first giving you the caveat that I don't know the details of the Indiana Public-Private Partnership. Or I know some of the details, I don't know all of them. The details, as I understand it, are that it's a 99-year lease to a private company that in return is going to build a road to the specifications of the state of Indiana and will have the revenues produced off of that road for 99 years and pay the state of Indiana for the right to do so through the lease. That's my understanding. It's also my understanding it's been politically very unpopular and there are going to be 3 Republicans get beat because of it.
What is the use of the revenues to be? Is it a dedicated use of revenues?
I do not know. I do not know. And if somebody does, chime in. Yes, sir.
2 questions. Number 1, would you favor local option gas tax surcharges by local communities? And second, why is the federal gas tax sent to Washington and then reallocated and earmarked and all that? Why not just let the states keep it or have a state option not to send any of that money to Washington?
Well, let's see. That's 2 questions. The first question, I think I would prefer. You asked my opinion, so I'm giving you my opinion. The special purpose local option sales tax or regional sales tax to a motor fuel tax for this reason. The sales tax is less volatile than the fuel tax. We talked about what the increase in the cost of petroleum has done to the revenue that's generated on the fuel tax, that's not as, you don't see as large an impact when you have a broader base like the sales tax. And there is a pretty good tie because most everything that's sold involves getting someplace to buy it, and that involves transportation. So it's not like it's a disconnected tax. And the second question was, why do we collect an income tax and send it to Washington and have the money sent back? I mean,
The fuel tax.
no, I know, but I'm just throwing back to you. Well, then you got to beg the question: well, why should we send a passenger facility charge on airplanes to Washington? Why should we send a income tax to Washington and send it back? The fact of the matter is, the country at a point in time saw a need to have a federal highway system, and figured the best way to finance that was on our motor fuel tax, built an interstate highway system, which was probably the single greatest accomplishment of Eisenhower's term in office and one of the great accomplishments in the history of the United States of America. And so that's why it was done. Now, as in the case of the tax on telephones to pay off the Spanish-American War, as over time taxes collected for one purpose, sometimes purposes change, and today most of that money is directed back to the states to build roads that are not in part of the interstate system but are a part of the connection to the interstate highway system in terms of state highways and feeder roads. And also because we are in the world is flat, the computers and the internet have leveled it, but transportation has also leveled it. And people do drive from Georgia to California. And there are legitimate national issues for the federal government to be involved in the coordination of surface transportation. That's my answer. Now, somebody was trying to correct me. I think the reporter was. Were you going to?
I was going to say, if you have a question, please state your name and your affiliation before you ask your question, and try to keep the question brief. We're taping this for posterity.
She said what she's really saying is keep the answer brief. She's just being nice. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to follow up on the Indiana question. The money, every penny of the $3.8 billion is dedicated to highway improvements in Indiana. So that money will all be used.
The lease money back. Yeah, I figured that was true, but I didn't know it to be a fact, so I didn't want to say something I didn't know. Unlike most politicians. Beautiful place, by the way.
You talk about these sales tax initiatives. We've experienced promises, pass the tax, and spend it on something else, and didn't get what they said they were going to do. How do you ensure that as a politician? When you go before the people, tell them what you're going to do, and then you get the money and spend it on pet projects like bicycle lanes and traffic calming devices and things other than widening the freeway. Which one of us passed it?
That is a great question, and the answer to that question in terms of the community improvement districts, which do the 5 mill levies, the special purpose local option sales taxes, and Georgia's lottery. Those are 3 distinct different revenue systems. Every one of those raise revenue for purposes that are in the law. I mean, you just can't do it. I mean, the special purpose local option sales tax allows government to invest in 6 specific areas of infrastructure, which is transportation, recreation, and emergency health issues, water and sewer, and one other thing. That's it. And in the referendum, you have to specify precisely where it's going. I mean, you do not know, and we've had one county in Georgia that did a special purpose education tax and spent money outside the definition of the law. They were taken to court, and the courts ruled, and they had to take all that money and put it back where it was supposed to go. It's in our lottery in Georgia. The reason our lottery is, we say in our lottery revenues can only go to Hope scholarships for students with a B average to go to college, adult and technical education, and web-based learning or internet. And that's the only place it goes. I mean, you can't spend it on anything. You can't buy books with it. You can't pay teachers with it. You can't put in bicycle paths with it or anything else. So the way you do it is how you write the law and how it's done. And also, in our case, the lottery is in the Constitution. And as a matter of fact, so is the special purpose local option sales tax. So it's constitutionally established as a limitation. And the voters, I chair the State Board of Education in Georgia. We have 179 school systems. I chair the State Board of Education when we put in the local option sales tax for schools, and with every one of those school systems except for 11 did a referendum to raise a penny tax for 5 years for school construction only. Just the construction of school facilities in lieu of the ad valorem tax. And of those 168 referendums, 166 of them passed. That's a pretty good record.
We have time for one more question.
Well, thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Figure I'll take it. One of the problems with the federal system of highway construction in particular is the layer after layer of federal agencies and bureaucracies, dozens of agencies that often have to sign off on all the environmental documents and other documents and regulation. And sometimes it takes a project up to 2 decades to be actually started. Safety Blue did some modest improvements to streamline that process, but a lot more needs to be done in that area, in my opinion. Would you agree with that?
That's a great question to finish on. Let me tell y'all something. We are going to have to change some minds / hearts in this country and understand that development and the environment are not natural enemies. They can be natural partners. In my judgment, there are some in the development community say, hell with the environment, I'll do as much as I can, but not that many. There are a lot in the environmental community that figure the best way to protect the environment is keep the development community from doing anything. And that's what has got us into a protracted process of land use approval and road construction, which I would submit to you has had a negative impact on the economy and a negative impact on the environment. You go into northwest Georgia today and you find 6 counties that are in non-attainment. They ain't got a smokestack industry. They ain't got an interstate highway. They just happen to be south of Chattanooga and under the exfoliated dome, which is known as the Bermuda, the Bermuda High, which stays over the southeastern Appalachian Mountains for 5 months out of the year and traps everything there. But because of overly burdensome regulation and no way to mitigate or move, they're sitting there with worse environmental problems because they can't do any improvements because they're non-attainment. It just does not make any sense to me. Now, you're talking to a guy who drives a hybrid automobile. I'm the guy that developed the subdivision I talked to you about, Wild Timber, with 43 acres dedicated to the environment. I believe with all my heart what I'm telling you. And so the environmental community and the development community have to come together. The Urban Land Institute is doing a great job to try and foster that. And quite frankly, TPL, the Trust for Public Land, although they have done a remarkable job of finding ways to attract land donation and conservation easements to protect vital areas of the environment and work hand in hand with the development community. I'm glad you asked the question because people have blinders on. There are developers that want to pave everything, cut every tree down, and they're wrong. And there are environmentalists who want to stop anything from happening, figuring that's better for the economy and the environment, and they're wrong. What's right is when you have a partnership. That's what's built everything in this country that's good, and recalcitrance has caused us all the problems that are bad, and it's time we fix that. It's just like the nuclear, I'm really just long answering, I apologize, but one of the big solutions to pollution and to the energy crisis and to the cost of petroleum and to the dependence on foreign oil is nuclear energy. And yet if it takes 15 years to go through an approval process and 14 judges and 19 lawsuits, what happens? The environment gets worse, pollution gets worse. We're doing everything we can now to get we got 15 applications for reactors in with the new energy bill. People that want to build reactors that aren't going to pollute, they're going to generate lower cost energy, they're going to take pressure off the environment. We're trying to get it where those applications can be improved in 7 rather than 15 years. I mean, give me a break. we need to start thinking positive about the goal and keep our eye on the goal. And if we do that as partners, understanding it's all our air, not just somebody's air, and it's all our country, not just somebody's country, and what got us to where we are is the free enterprise system, not the government, then we will go a long way towards solving most of these problems. And you've been very kind to have me today. Thank you.